Hello, and welcome to another episode of Noetic Resonance. Today's episode is brought to you by our fake sponsor game, Overrated, by Putt Putt Mini Golf. 2 out of 5 stars. One of the staff members tripped my senile grandpa for their prank YouTube video, and now he's in the ICU. Oh, goodness. Why is your grandpa at Putt Putt Mini Golf? I'm just kidding. That sounds exactly like what would really happen these days in this world. It's really sad. This episode is for educational, historical, and spiritual purposes only. Nothing shared here constitutes theological instruction or religious prescription. What I offer is research, context, and honest examination of where our practices came from and what they originally meant. As always, I will tell you clearly when something is established historical fact, when it is scholarly debate, and when it is my own interpretive read. Take what resonates, investigate what challenges you, and release what was never yours to carry. If you are here with us for episode 1 of this season, Sacred Waters, you already know that water is not ordinary. You know it defies the standard rules of physics in ways that make life possible. You know that the human brain is 73% water, that the eyes are closer to 98% water, and that every vision and every prayer and every moment of clarity you have ever had moved through water to reach you. You know that virtually every tradition across human history looked at water and recognized something in it that exceeded its chemistry. A presence, a responsiveness, a sacredness that no institution created and no institution can take away. Today we are going one step further, because if water is already sacred by its nature, then the human impulse to step into it deliberately at the most significant moments of life is not a religious invention. It is one of the oldest and most honest things we have ever done. Every culture on every continent, without coordination, without shared text or shared language, arrived at the same understanding that crossing a threshold in water means something, that immersion marks a before and an after, that the body already knows water is the right medium for saying out loud, I am not the same person I was before I stepped in. This episode is about that impulse, where it comes from, how ancient it is, how universal it is, and what happened when one institution decided it owned the ritual, could determine who performed it, who received it, and what it meant. Because the water was never theirs. It was never anyone's, and the threshold it marks has always belonged to every human being willing to step into it. Long before there was a church, long before there was a priest with the authority to perform or withhold a ritual, long before anyone wrote down a theology of baptism or argued about its proper method, human beings were stepping into water to mark the moments that mattered. This is not a Christian story. It is not even a religious story in the institutional sense. It is a human story, and it is old enough that we cannot find its beginning. Archaeological evidence of ritual water use dates back tens of thousands of years across multiple continents. What we can say with confidence is that by the time written records begin to give us a clear picture of human religious practice, water ritual is already everywhere, already ancient, already carrying the weight of something that cultures understood intuitively before they had language to explain it. In ancient Egypt, the concept of ritual purification in water was woven into both daily religious practice and the most significant ceremonial moments in Egyptian life. Priests purified themselves in sacred pools before entering temple spaces. The deceased were ritually cleansed before mummification and the journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. The Nile flood itself was understood as an annual act of sacred renewal, the waters rising and receding as a cosmic purification of the land and a restoration of life. In Mesopotamia, ritual washing was prescribed throughout the religious and legal codes of Sumerian and Babylonian culture. The Apkallu, the 7 ancient sages who brought civilization to humanity in Mesopotamian tradition, were associated with water and with the Abzu, the sacred underground freshwater ocean of the god Enki. Purification rites involving water preceded prayer, temple entry, and significant transitions in civic and religious life. In the Vedic tradition of ancient India, which is among the oldest continuously practiced religious traditions on earth, ritual bathing in sacred waters is prescribed throughout the Rig Veda, the oldest of the 4 Vedas, dating to approximately 1500 BCE or earlier. The concept of snana, sacred bathing, is understood not merely as physical cleansing, but as the removal of spiritual impurity and the restoration of ritual fitness for communication with the divine. The sacred rivers of India, particularly the Ganges, the Yamuna, and the now subterranean Saraswati, were understood as living goddesses whose waters carried transformative power. To bathe in them was not a metaphor. It was a direct encounter with the divine feminine expressed through water. In the indigenous traditions of Turtle Island, water ceremonies have always been understood as acts of relationship rather than ritual performance. The sweat lodge ceremony, followed by immersion in cold water, moves a participant through heat and darkness and water as a passage from one state of being to another, a death and rebirth enacted in the body rather than merely affirmed in belief. Water songs, water prayers, and the ceremonial carrying of water by women in the Anishinaabe tradition are living practices today, not historical artifacts, expressions of a relationship with water as a living being that has never been severed despite centuries of pressure to abandon it. In ancient Greece, the mysterious religions that flourished alongside and often in tension with the official Olympian cult all incorporated ritual water immersion or lustration as part of their initial processes. The Eleusinian mystery, centered at Eleusis near Athens and dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, required initiates to bathe in the sea before central ritual. The Orphic and Dionysian mystery traditions similarly used water as a threshold substance, marking the initiate's passage from ordinary life into the sacred inner circle of the community. These were not casual practices. They were the most serious and guarded religious experiences the ancient Greek world produced, and water stood at their entrance. In the Persian Zoroastrian tradition, ritual purity maintained through careful relationship with water was a central religious obligation. Water was considered one of the 7 sacred creations of Ahura Mazda, the supreme divine principle, and its contamination was understood as a spiritual offense as well as a practical one. The rituals of purification in Zoroastrian practice, some of which survive to this day in Parsi communities, involve water contact as a restoration of right relationship with the divine order. What all of these traditions share across thousands of years and thousands of miles of separation is the same fundamental understanding. Water marks the threshold. Crossing in water means something has changed. What was is left behind in the water, and what emerges is different from what went in. That understanding does not belong to Christianity. It does not belong to any single tradition. It is one of the most universal spiritual recognitions humanity has ever produced, and it is the deep root from which everything we are going to explore in this episode grows. To understand Christian baptism honestly, you have to begin not with John the Baptist, standing in the River Jordan, but with something far older that John was already working within. The mikveh, the Jewish ritual immersion bath, is the direct ancestor of Christian baptism. And understanding what it was and what it meant in its original context changes the entire picture of what Jesus submitted to and what early church inherited. The word mikveh comes from the Hebrew root meaning a gathering of waters, the same root used in Genesis 1:10 when the waters are gathered together on the 3rd day of creation. The mikveh was not a metaphor. It was a specific body of naturally gathered water, either a natural source like a river, spring, or rain-fed pool, or a specifically constructed bath fed by natural water, in which a person immersed themselves fully for the purpose of transitioning from one state of ritual purity to another. The Levitical law prescribed mikveh immersion for a wide range of transitions. After contact with what the code considered ritually impure, after menstruation, after childbirth, before entering the temple, before the high priest performed the Yom Kippur service, and for conversion to Judaism, where full immersion marked the moment a person crossed the threshold from outside the covenant community to inside it. Circumcision, established as a covenant marker in Genesis 17 between God and Abram, functioned alongside mikveh as the dual entry requirement into the covenant community for men. These practices are presented in the text as given directly by God to Moses at Sinai, part of the broader holiness code intended to distinguish Israel from surrounding nations and maintain ritual fitness for a community living in proximity to the divine presence in the tabernacle and later the temple. And here's where it gets theologically significant and where the says who thread becomes unavoidable. Because the person most frequently credited as the foundation of Christian baptism is also the person who most consistently and publicly challenged the very purity system that mikveh was a part of. Jesus touched lepers, the dead, and a woman with a hemorrhage, all of which rendered a person ritually impure under Levitical law. And he did it without any subsequent purification ritual. He healed on the Sabbath repeatedly in defiance of Sabbath purity regulations. In Mark 7, he explicitly and publicly declared all foods clean, a direct overturning of Levitical dietary law so significant that Mark's own editorial voice pauses to note what Jesus was doing. He engaged with Samaritans and Gentiles without the separation the purity code required. He consistently prioritized the person in front of him over the ritual requirement that surrounded them. Paul extended this theology trajectory in Galatians 5, arguing that circumcision itself was no longer required for Gentile believers entering the covenant community through Christ. The Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 affirmed this position, deciding that Gentile converts were not required to follow the full Mosaic law. So the early church inherited mikveh immersion, transformed it into baptism, and retained it as the entry rite into the new covenant community. But it set aside circumcision for Gentile believers. It largely abandoned the dietary purity laws. It did not require temple purification rituals. It selected what to carry forward and what to release. That selection was theologically intentional, shaped by what Jesus modeled and what Paul articulated, and understanding that the spirit of the covenant had always been about right relationship rather than ritual compliance, which raises the question the institution has never been fully comfortable answering. If Jesus himself was the most consistent challenger of the Levitical purity system, on what grounds does the church that claims to follow him invoke those same texts selectively to enforce compliance in areas that serve institutional interest? That is not a question about faith. It is a question about honesty. And the water, which was never owned by the Levitical system in the first place, was never owned by the church that succeeded it either. Now, John the Baptist was a Jewish prophet operating entirely within Jewish tradition. His baptism in the Jordan was not a new invention. It was a mikveh immersion applied to a specific moment of national and spiritual urgency, calling the Jewish people to repentance and preparation for what he understood was coming. The Jordan River itself was already loaded with covenantal significance in the Hebrew tradition. The boundary crossed by the Israelites entering the Promised Land, the water in which Elisha told Naaman to dip 7 times for healing. John was not operating outside of tradition. He was drawing on its deepest streams. And then Jesus came to be baptized. This detail deserves far more attention than it typically receives. If baptism was specifically a ritual of repentance and cleansing from sin, why did Jesus, whom his tradition understood as without sin, submit to it? The gospel writers themselves were clearly aware of this tension. Matthew 3:14 records John explicitly resisting, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" Jesus responds not by explaining his sinlessness, but by saying it is proper to fulfill all righteousness. The Greek word translated as fulfill here, plero, is the same word used elsewhere in Matthew for the fulfillment of prophetic texts. Jesus was not submitting to baptism as a sinner seeking cleansing. He was enacting something, identifying completely with the people he came to, stepping into the same waters they stepped into, crossing the same threshold, participating in the human condition as its most honest and vulnerable point of transition. That is a very different theological reading than baptism as sin washing, and it is worth sitting with. The early church debated intensely what baptism accomplished. Was it the moment of salvation itself? Was it an outward sign of an inward transformation that had already occurred? Was it a covenant marker like circumcision, the new covenant's entry rite? Did it need to be performed by an authorized person in a specific way to be valid? These debates were not settled quickly or cleanly. The Didache, one of the earliest Christian documents outside the New Testament, dated by many scholars to the late 1st century and functioning as a practical manual for early Christian communities covering baptism, fasting, prayer, and communal life, gives instructions that reveal how fluid the practice still was. It describes the preference for flowing water, river or springs, but explicitly allows for still water if running water is unavailable, and for pouring water on the head 3 times if full immersion is not possible. The flexibility is striking. The early community was clearly working out the practice as they went, holding the spirit of the ritual more firmly than its precise form, which is itself a significant theological statement about what the water was always meant to be. As Christianity moved outward from its Jewish roots into the broader Greco-Roman world, baptism traveled with it and encountered a world that already understood exactly what it meant to be immersed in water as a threshold act. To understand how significant this was, it helps to know something about the spiritual landscape early Christianity was moving through. The Eleusinian mysteries were the most revered religious experience the ancient Greek world produced, practiced at the town of Eleusis, near Athens, for approximately 2,000 years, from around 1500 BCE until the Christian emperor Theodosius shut them down in 329 CE. They were centered on the myth of Demeter, goddess of grain, and her daughter Persephone, who was abducted by Hades into the underworld, establishing through her partial return the cycle of death and seasonal renewal. Initiates underwent fasting, a procession to Eleusis, ritual bathing in the sea, and a night of secret rites so carefully guarded that 2,000 years of practice produced almost no detailed record of what happened in the innermost ceremony. What initiates did describe consistently was transformation, a permanent shift in their relationship to life and death. Ancient figures, included Cicero, Plato, and Pindar, were initiates and described the experience as removing the fear of death entirely. The Mithraic cult was a mystery religion that spread throughout the Roman Empire roughly from the 1st through 4th century CE, particularly popular among Roman soldiers. It borrowed the name Mithras from the ancient Persian and Vedic deity Mitra, a god of covenants and sacred light, but developed independently in the Western Empire as its own distinct tradition. Initiates passed through 7 grades of initiation, shared sacred communal meals, and met in underground temples called Mithraea. The parallels with early Christianity were close enough that early church fathers like Justin Martyr and Tertullian acknowledged them explicitly, attributing the similarities to demonic imitation rather than shared cultural natural inheritance, which itself tells you something about how threatening those parallels felt to the institutional church. Both the Eleusinian tradition and Mithraism used water ritual as part of initiation. Both enacted death and rebirth symbolism. Both understood that something had to die in the crossing and something different had to emerge on the other side. When Paul wrote to communities in Corinth, Ephesus, and Rome about dying and rising with Christ through baptism, he was using language his audience already had a living framework for. What was new was the specific content, the identification of the dying and rising figure as the historical Jesus of Nazareth. For the first several centuries of Christianity, baptism was administered in rivers, public baths, private homes, and whatever water was available. The Didache describes the preference for flowing water but explicitly allows for still water if running water is unavailable, and for pouring water on the head 3 times if full immersion is not possible. The early community was clearly holding the spirit of the ritual more firmly than its precise form. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, describes no elaborate ceremony and no required officiant beyond a member of the community. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, begins to formalize the theology more rigidly, arguing that baptism must be performed properly to be valid, and beginning the conversation about who holds the authority to administer it. This is the beginning of the institutional capture of the water. As the church grew and developed a clerical hierarchy, baptism became increasingly tied to that hierarchy. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, as the church merged with Roman imperial power under Constantine, to be baptized was to be Christian. And to be Christian was increasingly to be a legitimate member of Roman society. The water that had always belonged to everyone was now administered by a specific class of authorized people within a specific institutional structure. And then came the doctrine that made institutional control of baptism feel not just appropriate, but urgently necessary. Original sin as a formal theological doctrine is not in the teachings of Jesus. It is not in Paul in its fully developed form. It is Augustine's innovation, developed in the late 4th and early 5th century CE. And it is worth understanding exactly where it came from because it changed everything about how baptism was understood and administered. Augustine read Romans 5:12, "Sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned," in a way that the Greek text does not straightforwardly support. The Greek phrase, "Epho pantes hamarton," is most naturally translated as "because all sinned," meaning death spread to all because all personally sin, not because all inherit Adam's guilt from birth. Augustine was reading from the Latin Vulgate translation, which rendered the phrase differently and built his doctrine of inherited guilt on that translation. The Eastern Orthodox tradition, which maintained the Greek text, never developed the same doctrine. They understand humanity as inheriting mortality and a tendency toward sin from Adam, but not inherited guilt, a significantly different theological position with significant practical consequences. Jesus himself never described children as arriving in the world in a state of condemnation. He said in Matthew 18:3 that you must become like little children to enter the kingdom of heaven. Not that children must be cleansed to enter it. He welcomed children, touched them, blessed them, and said the kingdom belongs to such as these. There is no statement from Jesus suggesting infants are born guilty before God, requiring ritual correction. The anxiety that drove infant baptism was Augustine's theological framework colliding with devastating rates of infant mortality in a world where the institutional church had claimed exclusive authority over eternal life. The church held the water. The doctrine created the urgency, and the combination made baptism of infants feel not just appropriate, but essential, a matter of eternal life and death for every child born. The Anabaptists, the reformers who insisted that baptism should be administered only to conscious believers capable of making an informed decision of faith, were persecuted by both Catholic and Protestant authorities for this position. People were executed for arguing that an infant should not be baptized before they could choose. They were killed, in other words, for arguing about water. That is the measure of how completely the institution had claimed ownership of something that had always belonged to the people and to the water itself. Says who that a child arrives in this world already guilty before a God who Jesus consistently describes as running toward the prodigal before the apology was finished? Says who that the first act required of new life is institutional cleansing from a condition the one whose name the institution carries never described them as having. The water was never the institution's to dispense or withhold, and the threshold it marks was always available to every human being willing to step into it. There is something worth naming before we go further into the cross-traditional landscape of water ritual, and it is something that science is now giving us the language for that the traditions already knew. Water does not just mark a threshold symbolically. It induces one physiologically. When you immerse yourself in water, particularly cold or moving natural water, your body activates what is called the mammalian dive reflex, a hardwired neurological response that slows the heart rate, activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and restore system that directly counteracts the fight or flight stress response, and shifts the brain into a measurably different state. Research on what marine biologist Dr. Wallace J. Nichols calls blue mind, the neurological state induced by proximity to and immersion in water, consistently shows reduced cortisol levels, lowered heart rate, and a shift away from the anxious, ruminating, self-critical mental activity that most people live in most of the time. Full body immersion specifically induces what neuroscientists call transient hypofrontality, a temporary quieting of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for the constant narrative voice of the worried, planning, self-judging mind. When that quiets, what remains is something every contemplative tradition across human history has pointed toward: the witness, the observer, the deeper self beneath the noise. Water brings you back to yourself, not metaphorically, but neurologically. It interrupts the anxious mind and creates a threshold state, a moment of genuine openness in which something can shift, something can be released, something can be received that the busy, defended mind would have deflected. Flotation therapy, sensory deprivation tanks filled with body temperature saltwater has documented clinical efficacy for anxiety, PTSD symptoms, and chronic pain because removing sensory input while suspending the body in water induces that same hypofrontal state in a prolonged and deepened form. Even partial water contact activates the reflex. Cold water splashed on the face, hands and wrists submerged in water, standing in the rain. The body responds because the body remembers. This is what every tradition that used water as a threshold substance was pointing toward without having the neuroscience vocabulary to name it. The institution called it cleansing from sin. The neuroscientist calls it parasympathetic activation and transient hypofrontality. The Anishinaabe grandmother carrying water in ceremony calls it relationship with the living being. The Hindu pilgrim walking for days to stand in the Ganges calls it darshan, direct encounter with the divine. They are all pointing at the same thing from different angles. Water brings you back to yourself. And from that place of return to self, genuine transformation becomes possible in a way it simply is not when you are living entirely in the defended, anxious, narrating mind. Now, when you understand that, the cross-traditional picture of water immersion becomes even more significant, because every tradition we are about to look at was not just performing a religious ceremony. They were accessing a real and documentable threshold state that water reliably induces in the human nervous system, and they understood through lived experience rather than laboratory measurement that this was the right condition in which to cross a significant threshold in a person's life. In the Hindu tradition, snana, ritual bathing, is one of the oldest continuously practiced sacred acts on earth, prescribed throughout the Rig Veda, and understood as direct encounter with the divine expressed through water. The Kumbh Mela brings tens of millions of people to sacred rivers at astrologically significant moments because the body already knows what the tradition has always taught, that standing in a river together at the right moment marks something real. In Sikhism, the Sarovar, the sacred pool surrounding the Golden Temple in Amritsar, is a site of ritual bathing called Ishnan. As always, thank y'all for being patient with me with my pronunciations. I really try my best to say things correctly. Ishnan was understood as both physical and spiritual purification. The Guru Granth Sahib emphasizes that true purification is of the mind and heart, but the practice of bathing in the Sarovar persists as an expression of humility and devotion, the body participating in what the spirit is doing. In Shinto tradition of Japan, misogi, ritual purification in natural water, is one of the foundational spiritual disciplines, ideally performed standing under a waterfall or in a natural stream. The practitioner allows moving water to carry away spiritual impurity and active surrender to what the water does rather than passive reception of something performed by someone else. That distinction matters. In the Islamic tradition, ghusl, the full body ritual bath, is required at specific significant thresholds: after sexual relations, after menstruation, after childbirth, and for the deceased before burial. The whole self brought into contact with water at the crossing point between one state and another. In West African tradition and its diaspora expressions in Candomblé and Santeria, water rituals for specific orishas, particularly Yemanja and Oshun, involve immersion and contact with water as direct encounter with divine presence, healing, blessing, and initiation. These are not symbolic gestures. They are understood as real exchanges between the practitioner and the living divine force present in the water. Among the Mandaeans, a religious community with ancient roots in present-day Iraq and Iran, and possibly the oldest continuously practiced Gnostic tradition on earth, baptism, called masbuta, is not a one-time initiation, but a repeated ritual performed multiple times throughout a person's life at significant thresholds, always in flowing natural water called yardna, understood as a living divine presence. The Mandaeans trace their practice directly to John the Baptist, who they revere as their primary prophet, predating and independent of the Christian use of his figure. Their repeated immersion in living water throughout a lifetime rather than a singular institutional event is perhaps the clearest surviving example of what water ritual looked like before it was hardened into a once-only sacrament controlled by the ordained. What connects all of these traditions across their vast theological differences is the same understanding the neuroscience is now confirming. Water brings you back to yourself. It quiets what is defended and noisy and afraid. It opens a threshold state in which the person who goes under is genuinely different from the person who comes up, not because an institution declared it so, but because the water, the nervous system, and the intention of the person crossing the threshold all work together to make it real. That has always been enough. It was always the point. So let us bring it all the way home. You have been told, many of you, that baptism is a sacrament administered by the ordained, that its validity depends on who performs it and how, that without the correct formula spoken by the correct person in the correct institutional context, something essential is missing from what the water does. You have been told that infants must be brought to the institution as quickly as possible to be cleansed of a guilt they arrived carrying, a guilt that Jesus never described them as having, and that the Greek text Paul wrote in does not straightforwardly support. You have been told that the water belongs to the church, that the threshold it marks is controlled by the church, that your access to what the water offers is mediated by the church's willingness to offer it to you on the church's terms, and now you know where that came from. It did not come from the Jordan River where John stood calling people to cross a threshold together in water of their own tradition. It did not come from Jesus, who stepped into that same water, not to be cleansed of sin he did not carry, but to stand completely with the people he came to cross the threshold with them rather than above them. It did not come from the Didache community that said use running water if you can, still water if you cannot, and pour it on the head 3 times if that is what you have available, because the spirit of the crossing matters more than the precise form of it. It did not come from the tens of millions of people who walk for days to stand in a river together at the Kumbh Mela, because the body already knows that water marks a threshold, and the threshold belongs to everyone willing to cross it. It did not come from the Mandaean communities who immerse in flowing natural water not once but repeatedly throughout a lifetime because they understand that crossing the threshold is not a single institutional event but a living, ongoing practice of return and renewal. It came from Augustine reading a Latin translation and building a doctrine of inherited guilt that made institutional control of the water feel urgently necessary. It came from Constantine merging the church with imperial power and making baptism a civic as well as spiritual marker. It came from a clerical hierarchy that needed the water to belong to them in order to maintain the authority structure they had built around it. It came from the same fear machine and the same money machine and the same institutional capture we have been examining all first season and continuing into this one. Dressed this time not in tithing language or marriage language, but the language of salvation and the eternal fate of your unbaptized child. Says who that the water belongs to the institution? Says who that the threshold it marks requires an ordained gatekeeper to be valid before God? Says who that the river in your city, the rain falling on your face, the ocean at the edge of the land, the glass of water you hold in your hands with intention, cannot do what the water has always done for every human being who has ever stepped into it with an open heart and a willingness to be changed. The earliest Christians were baptized in rivers and private homes with no professional clergy present. The Didache community adjusted the method based on what was available without apology. Jesus himself crossed the threshold in a public river alongside everyone else, not in a controlled institutional setting with verified credentials on all sides. The water was never owned, the threshold was never controlled, and the crossing was never yours to be denied. Sovereign immersion looks like this. You step into water, whatever water is available and meaningful to you, with the full weight of your intention behind you. You name what you are leaving behind. You name what you are moving toward. You let the water receive what was and carry it. And you come up different, not because an institution granted you permission to be different, but because you chose to cross, and the water, which has been holding this threshold for every human being who has ever lived, received you the way it has always received every person willing to step in. You do not need a priest. You do not need a formula. You do not need a certificate or a record in a parish register or the approval of a hierarchical structure that was not present at the Jordan and was not consulted when the traditions of Turtle Island or the banks of the Ganges or the sacred wells of the Celtic world developed their own understanding of what the water does. You need the water, you need your intention, and you need the willingness to let what was be washed from you and what is becoming take its first breath on the other side. That has always been enough. It was enough before the institution arrived, and it will be enough long after the institution's particular requirements have been forgotten. The water was never theirs. It was never anyone's. It has been holding this threshold since before the first tradition gave it a name, since before the first institution claimed authority over who could step into it and what it meant when they did. You came from water, you are made of water, and every time you step into it with intention, whether in a river, an ocean, a bathtub, a rainfall, or a quiet moment of contact with something that flows. You are participating in one of the oldest and most honest acts in human history. You are saying, I am willing to cross. I am willing to let what was stay behind me in the water. I am willing to come up different. The institution did not give you that. It cannot take it from you either. Next time we gather, we are going into the library, the books that were removed from your Bible, the ones the apostles quoted and assumed you had read, the book of Enoch, the book of Tobit, the wisdom of Solomon, First Maccabees, the book of Sirach, the texts that were in the Christian Bible for over 1,000 years before a budget decision by 19th century Protestant publishers quietly removed them. Bring your curiosity and bring your says who. As always, I love you, I see you, and none of us are left behind. Our journey continues. Much love and positive vibes, you beautiful souls.